Dr. Quinton White began his career at Jacksonville University in 1976 as a visiting assistant professor, and then went on to start the Marine Science program in 1978, serving as department chair, division chair, dean of arts and sciences, and he retires next month as executive director of the Marine Science Research Institute and professor emeritus of biology and marine science. He has traveled extensively, taking students literally across the globe. Dr. White has authored numerous research papers and technical papers. His research focused on the history of human impact on the St. Johns River, manatees, and water quality issues. He served as consultant to the City of Jacksonville's Waterways Commission for over 30 years. And the MSRI opened in 2010 and is the first and only LEED certified gold building on the JU campus. Dr. White has been active in the Jacksonville community and received numerous awards for his service. He was president of Leadership Jacksonville, the Museum of Science and History, and the Jacksonville Community Council, Inc., which is where I met him when I was working for JCCI. He was a founding member of the St. Johns Riverkeeper. Dr. White writes a monthly column in the Florida Times-Union called River Life about river-related issues, which he hopes to turn into a book, which should be very good. He has been active on, I think I'm saying this, OSEARCH, is that? OSEARCH, oh, okay, at JU, which they research sharks, correct? Working to establish their headquarters at Mayport, Florida. Not bad for a guy who thought he would be at JU for 2 years. His sermon today, or his talk today, is St. John's River, 50 Years of Change. I welcome Dr. White.
Kathleen, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I actually have spoken here before, and I love the sanctuary. I love the view. It really is sort of humbling. It's interesting when you reach this point in your life where you're retiring, and people say, oh, we're going to miss you. I say, I'm not dying, I'm just retiring. And I hope I can be like my friend Sharon Scholl here, who is still active in doing things. And I see some other folks in the congregation that I recognize, and so it's really fun to be here. But you do sort of reach that point in your life. Last night we happened to be at a memorial celebration for a gentleman named Bill Robertson, who had been at JU for a number of years and hired me. And then I had not realized that Jay Hubner had passed away. I just heard that. And then yesterday I had learned another friend of mine passed away. And it sort of brought back something I've been thinking about recently. We go through sort of 3 phases of our lives, and I've sort of begun to realize this recently. That early phase when you go through a bunch of birthday parties, you know, that's what you're doing. And then you go to that middle phase where you go to a bunch of marriages. Well, we reached the funeral stage, folks. You know, it is what it is. But it's part of change. And so, you know, Heracles made the comment, the only constant in life is change, and that is certainly where we are today. Crystal is going to be moving these along as we sort of go. I sort of point out that, and Kathleen already mentioned this, I arrived at JU in 1976 thinking I'd be there for 2 years. And then we moved on to start the marine science major. And I have been working on this kind of talk for a while because I began realizing that, yeah, things change, but some things stay the same. Next. I was able to build a Marine Science Research Institute with a lot of support from a lot of people, and that has been one of the crowning achievements of my life. Even though I say my biggest achievement, frankly, is my 3 children. I'm more proud of them than anything else. And my wife has been a great supporter, and I thank her for her comments this morning. Next. I started thinking about how we do things and how I used to do presentations. And I used to have to spend a lot of time using something called rapidograph pens, drawing pictures and drawing illustrations and drawing graphs. And then I would take slides, and they go into a carousel. And I've still got thousands of 2x2 slides sitting in my office, or actually my den right now. And we use overhead projectors and stuff like that. And now we do PowerPoint. And Crystal had to remind me earlier this week that I had the wrong format, so we changed it so it looked like this. So next. I started thinking about things that happened in marine science over the years. And I'll sort of let you read through the little list there on the screen. But transistors became important. Why? Because electronics have become so important in how we do our work today. We threw away some equipment recently at JU that's become obsolete because it was a telecommunications system. You've got it on your phone now. FaceTime, Zoom. You know, it's what we all have, and yet it's where we move along. Next slide. We used to do a lot of analytical work, and we had to use something called standard methods. And I hate to say it now, we've gone to much more automated systems. Next slide. We used to do something that to look at salinity, we had to use a refractometer, or we actually titrated with sodium nitrate, which left our fingers black because we didn't use gloves. We're too macho with that. Now it's in a handheld meter, and we can do all that. Next slide. Dissolved oxygen. We used to do something called Winkler method, which was very cumbersome, very involved, and now we handheld meter again. And we can do all these things at the same time. So things we used to do took a while. Next. So these things sort of happened over time as we sort of evolved using spectrophotometry, and now we use other HPLC kind of technology to measure chlorophyll. And again, handheld meter. It happens very quickly. So next slide. So how has the river changed over these years? I have seen a huge amount of change in the 50 years I've been in Jacksonville. And it's still 310 miles long. It still flows north, but I'll sort of quickly add, it's not one of 3 rivers in the world that flow north. There are lots of rivers that flow north. But it is unique in that it's wholly contained within the state of Florida. And so we have the ability geopolitically and geographically to do a lot to control what we do to that river, and yet we still haven't learned our lesson yet. Next slide. The basin of the St. Johns River, as I mentioned, is 310 miles long. It's almost 8,000 square miles. It's 1/6 of the state of Florida. All that drains through the St. Johns and out the mouth of the St. Johns River. Next. The river itself is very flat. In fact, 310 miles long, almost the entire length, 200 miles, I shouldn't say the entire, the 200 miles of it is a flat system, over 200 miles. Only the last 100 miles or so, and it falls all of 27 feet out of the mountains of Florida. So next slide. You go back to the history, Ponce de Leon in 1513 found Florida, the land of flowers. And you know, I can imagine what Florida must have looked like and must have smelled like. You know, and I think about that in a positive way because of all the flowers and all the scents, and yet we have overwhelmed that in some ways with what we do now and the amount of construction we've had over the years. Next slide. Jean Ribaud found the St. Johns River theoretically on May 1st, and he had set out, you may be aware that he lost his life in Matanzas Inlet, which means bloody marsh down south of St. Augustine. Ironically, Matanzas Inlet used to be the northern extreme of mangroves. Why was that important? Because that was the freeze line. Well, now we've seen with climate change, we've seen the freeze line migrate north. We have mangroves in Georgia now. And so we're seeing things happen with climate change as they move along. Next slide. This is sort of an interesting map, one of the first maps of the United States, published in 1562. I sort of point out to you, if you look at it, it's very hard angle northeast, southwest. And people sort of forget that. Jacksonville sits at one of the westernmost points on the Atlantic coast. And in fact, if you go due north, anybody know what the first major city you run into going due north? Anybody? Cleveland, Ohio. We're Midwest, folks. You didn't know it. There's a little bump there in the slide. That's the peninsula of Florida. The topographers realize that, but that's sort of what happened. Next slide. Townford, the Calford name was because the St. Johns River was a very slow, meandering river. Cows used to ford the river, and cows can swim. They never walked across the river. It was probably 10 to 12 feet deep at that point. But we have now deepened the river to 47 feet in some places by dredging, actually in 50 feet at the mouth now. But Calford goes back to the name when the Spanish brought cows. Cows are not native to Florida. Cows were brought here as food, turned loose, and the original Florida crackers were the cowboys that used cracking whips to round up the cattle and drive them to market. If you haven't read a book called Land Remembered by Patrick Smith, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book that describes the early days of Florida. It's a historical fiction, but it's a really, really good book to read and get a flavor for how the state evolved. Next slide. So here's Calford. Next slide. I'm used to clicking through this, so we're sort of working through our thing. This is the mouth of the St. Johns River. Used to have a lot of shoaling, a lot of sandbars, and in fact, the sandbars were there because the sand migrates sort of on a north-south motion because of the northeaster storms push the sand south. We built jetties at the mouth to correct that problem because it made it difficult to get ships in and out. At the north side, we had a little town called Pilot Town, and on the south side was a little town called Mayport Mills. We shortened that to Mayport. They were the towns that the bar pilots, these were the ship owners or ship mariners, I should say, who could navigate the bars because every storm, almost every tide, those bars would shift. And so we began in the late 1800s building the jetties that would stabilize that. What that did was it built up sand on the north side. Huguenot Park has now accumulated a great deal of sand while it washes away south of us. You've just seen a renourishment completed down in St. Johns County where we spent millions and millions of dollars to pump sand onto the beach to maintain the beach community. So here's Pilot Town and Mayport Mills. Next slide. First bridge across the St. Johns River was not an automobile bridge, but Henry Flagler built it to carry trains. And so the Florida East Coast Railroad coming across the St. Johns River was the first bridge. The first automobile bridge was the Acosta Bridge, the Main Street Bridge, built in 1921. Keep going. So here's another slide. Keep going. This is the Matthews looking across the downtown Jacksonville, the Ford plant, which we just tore down, used to build Model Ts and Model As up until 1929 when it ceased productions. It was an interesting building. I used to work at Ford Motor Company in Norfolk, Virginia through college and had the same kind of construction. Henry Ford believed that the entire floor should be all for assembling trucks and cars, and all the bathrooms and offices were suspended in these gray boxes above the floor. And it was still in there when they tore it down, which was sort of fascinating. Next one. So this was what the St. John looked like in 1918. You'll notice along the northern banks, there are no roads, there are no islands. August Heckscher built Heckscher Drive as a toll road out to Pilot Town. And so we would dredge out the river and pile the sediment along the north bank, covering up the salt marsh. That has had a tremendous impact in how the river behaved over the years. Next slide. So now this is what it looks like more today. We put in the jetties, we have built land, we've created Heckscher Drive. It used to be a toll road. The Intercoastal Waterway was dug by the East Coast Florida Barge Company, or Canal Company, to handle barge traffic. There used to be a gate across it. A little guy in a rowboat, you paid him and you got to use the canal. Next slide. So we've watched downtown Jacksonville change over the years. We've gradually encroached on the city and filling in the land and pushing in towards the city. underneath the Main Street Bridge, we have a water depth of about 75 feet. This is because of the scouring of the water. About 5.5 billion gallons a day flow out of the St. Johns River into the Atlantic. As I mentioned, 1/6 of the state of Florida drains through Jacksonville. Most of our pollution, frankly, comes from south of us. It's not homegrown in that respect. Next slide. So this is sort of an aerial view looking down on, you can sort of get the feel for how we have bulkheaded and projected that. And if you've ever been in that area of the river, the velocity of the water when it's going out is quite ferocious. And in fact, it's interesting, at times the water flows out in one below, on the surface we'll be going in one direction, and underneath we'll be going in another direction. Made it very, very difficult to sample in that area. You've got areas like Exchange Island, which is an old dredge spoil island. When we dredged the river, we had to put that material somewhere. And so we used to pile it up along the shore and make dredge spoil islands. We have dredged our marshes, and you have seen these areas down around the JTB Bridge, in which we have created uplands by dredging out the marsh. The marshes are our kidneys. The marshes are what filter the water and protect us, and yet we have destroyed it over the years. Next slide. This is one of the earliest pictures we have of Northeast Florida, and it's a little hard to see on the screen this morning, but if you look at it closely, you'll discover it's actually upside down. It's also in French, which is a little, so when you look at it, you say, what the heck? But it had to do with the cartographers really didn't think the river flowed north. And I think when they were trying to draw it, they thought it flowed south, and so they drew it that way. Because remember, people were taking information from the, quote, New World back to Europe to draw these maps. But it's sort of an interesting depiction. But you get the feeling because the river meandered. It was a slow-moving river. 5.5 billion gallons of water sounds like a lot of water, but it's a very slow-moving river. It was a very flat river. And we have gradually pushed that, making it narrower and narrower and narrower to speed up the flow of water for commerce. This was all driven by money. Next slide. So you look at areas like Blunt Island. Next slide. Highly modified. 1940s, we actually dug the Dames Point, Fulton Point cut. And if you've gone across the Dames Point Bridge, you've seen this area. That was not there. The backwater was the area behind that. And there's another map that sort of shows that. The little indentation in Blunt Island was the old offshore power systems. Offices used to be across the street here, not far from the church. And when I first got to town, that was a hot thing. They were building floating nuclear power plants here in Northeast Florida. Next slide. So we watched the river change. Showed you a piece of this picture earlier as it meandered around. Next slide. And we've watched things twist and turn. Downtown Jacksonville was only a little piece of uplands that was there. But you look at most of the area around Jacksonville was actually marsh, and we've gradually filled all that in over time. Next slide. We've also had things like the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. We blocked up the Ocklawaha River. Rodman was the name of a plantation not far from where the dam was built. This was all part of an effort that actually started back during the Civil War with the idea of digging a big canal across Florida to avoid having to take ships all the way around Florida. Got more momentum back in World War I and then World War II, and then finally began doing it in the 50s and 60s. It was interesting because the people in the area did not want it to happen because it was going to mess up the fishing, mess up the economy, and mess up the water quality. But we persisted, I say we collectively, to build the Cross-Border Barge Canal, dammed up the Ocklawaha River, created the Rosman Reservoir, and in doing so, we modified the amount of flow going into the river, about 150 million gallons a day. And we also began potentially impacting the Floridan aquifer. Florida sits on what we call karst topography. Most of our water comes from that limestone underneath us that holds, it's like Swiss cheese full of water, and we actually pull water from that to drink. And so in 1972, Richard Nixon stopped the Florida Barge Canal project. And we've been trying to now restore the Ocklawaha ever since then. Next slide. One of the dramatic impacts was we've seen a rather dramatic drop in water flow out of the Ocklawaha into the St. Johns River. Why? Mostly evaporation. We filled in roughly 15,000 acres, and so those are about 20 springs that bubble into the St. Johns River are now pressured down because of the water on top. There is some movement to restore the Ocklawaha, and I hope that that's going to happen sometime in my lifetime. I think it probably will, probably in the next few years. That will restore a great deal of flow of fresh water back to the St. Johns River. One of the problems we've had as we have filled in marsh and we have paved and modified our uplands is we've modified the flow of the river, and we've seen salinity gradually move further and further upstream. If you go around Julian Creek right now, you'll find dead cypress trees, down by the river because they've been exposed to salt water. And that's been going on for years and years and years as it sort of began to occur. Next slide. Why did we do some of this stuff? Well, the Panama Canal was pushing us. One of the benefits of having some time this past year, my wife and I visited Panama and the Panama Canal this past April, and I have to admit, it's a marvel. It's an engineering marvel. The story behind us doing the Panama Canal was not the prettiest in the world, to say the least, but we did it, and it is sort of a phenomenal operation. They created a great lake in the middle of Panama that flows through the Panama Canal out into the north, into either the Atlantic or Pacific appropriately. So the entire system, the old Panama Canal, worked not with any pumps, it was all gravity. And it's amazing, we actually were on a ship that dropped 27 feet in 7 minutes in one of the docks. And it was pretty phenomenal. And so we've watched this happen. And the driving force behind that was when they then built the new Panama Canal, the new set of locks. The old Panama Canal had been 40 feet. Jacksonville's, historically, when I first got to Jacksonville, the depth to Talleyrand, which is right across from JU, not far from here, was about 35 feet. And we gradually deepened that so that in 2010, we finally got to 40 feet there. Well, why is that significant? Well, we opened the Panama Canal in 1914. So it took almost 100 years for us to get to the depth that allowed for us to take the maximum size of the Panama ships coming through there. Well, we were dealing with something called post-Panamax shipping, which meant that as we enlarged the Panama Canal and we deepened the depth to 50 feet, and it's now done with locks, and it's a recirculating system. There's lots of pumping and lots of things going on. Again, it's a marvel to be there and look at it. But we have created this demand for these larger ships that will take up to 50 feet of water. They're huge. When we went through the Panama Canal, we were on a small sort of ferry boat, and this giant grain carrier came in behind us, which is really sort of interesting to sit there and watch this big ship come in behind you. But it stops. They have these little electric mules that pull the ships in and out. But in doing so, it created a race to find out who in the East Coast could have the deepest ports. And so Miami, Jacksonville, Savannah, Charleston, Baltimore, New York, et cetera. Some of these were already naturally deep. New York is. Charleston deepened its port. Savannah has deepened its port. Jacksonville has gone to 47 feet. We'll be at 50 feet before long. We have a history of, beginning in the late 1800s, every 10 or 15 years deepening the river by about 5 or 10 feet. And so we're continually deepening the river, continually modifying it, continually changing it. And so with the Panama Canal, it's not going to be much longer. We're at 42 feet right across from JU right now. They're going to deepen that to 50 at some point in time. And we've seen the area up to Dames Point now deepened to 47 feet, but they'll go to 50 before much longer. So we continue to do this. Next slide. Now here's one of the first ships going through the Panama Canal. Next slide. And it continues. This is what's been going on here in Jacksonville. We had that Jacksonville Harbor Deepening Project, and we finally completed it in May of 22, which provided 47 feet for vessels coming into Jacksport. When you look at what's happened to the harbor over the years, is we have gradually seen this deepening. We've gradually been changing the river, and we don't seem to quite understand that we're impacting the river. One of the amazing things about the St. Johns River is its resiliency. It has continued to provide recreation, provide fish. I don't recommend eating fish from the St. Johns River, but that's another whole story. And there's more and more concern about what's going on, but we still have a healthy blue crab population there. We still get shrimp from the river, and yet we have gradually modified the river over time. Next slide. And the growth continues. This week I think we heard that the state of Florida hit 23 million people. There was less than 10 million here when I got the flight to the state. Out of curiosity, how many of you are from Florida? One, maybe 10, and that's fairly typical. My wife was born in Jacksonville, and I've given talks where very, very few people most of us came from someplace else, and it's who we are. And so we've seen this happen. Next slide. You sort of look at where we are today. The green on that illustration is the preserved conservation land we have today. The red is what's been developed. If you project out to 2060, next slide, that's what it begins to look like. The red is the development. Now, this particular illustration doesn't show any more preservation conservation lands. Thank goodness we are still, in fact, preserving and conserving lands, so hopefully we'll keep up that a little bit. But we're seeing this gradual growth. One of the problems we're running into, next slide, that's a comparison between the two, just to give you that. Next slide, is water. The never-ending thirst. We keep pulling water out of the Florida aquifer, and yet we don't really know how much water is in the Florida aquifer. It extends Florida, Georgia, Alabama. It's a huge basin of water, but we're not sure how much water is in it. And so we continue to pull it out. We've watched the level drop. We're not sure where we're going to end up on that. And regretfully, half of that water is water we spray on our yards. We don't even drink it. We use it for irrigation. I've said many, many times, if I were a benevolent dictator, I would ban St. Augustine grass. We have a very nice set of weeds in our grass that looks pretty good when it rains. And so this summer, it looks great. If it's drought, it's a little scraggy sometimes, but we don't water, don't fertilize, because I don't think people realize that all that stuff runs off into the river and makes a difference in what we do and what happens. Next slide. Manatees, one of our big charismatic megafauna. Everybody loves manatees. They're so ugly that they're pretty. I never have quite figured out how people thought they were mermaids, but But then I've also never been on a ship with a bunch of guys for 4 years, and that was the first living thing I saw on the water. So it is what it is. I've been really involved in the manatee protection plans for this area for Duval County for a number of years. That's what got me involved in the Waterways Commission for a while, and it's been nice watching the Waterways Commission go from being mostly manatees to actually much more river focused. But one of the things that we've had happen is I've watched the manatee population go from, and there's a video of me about 25 years ago saying I thought the manatee would be extinct in our lifetime. At the time, we were killing them faster than we were being born. We turned that corner through awareness, and we began to see the manatee population rebound rather nicely until about 3 years ago, when the excess nutrients that we saw running into the river were causing algae blooms that basically clouded in the water so much that the grass that they fed on died, and they starved to death. Over 1,000 starved to death. And this had a huge impact on the manatee population. We actually resorted, I'll say we collectively, the Fish and Wildlife, resorted to feeding manatees in order to survive, to get them to survive. That's not a good option. No time you want to make wild animals reliant on humans for their food. But the last year or so, we've seen a rebound a little bit. Nobody wants to kill a manatee, but they get hit by boats. They get killed by starvation. They get things like that. Next slide. And so we have seen a little bit of a rebound. We haven't had what we call a synoptic sample. We don't really have a good handle on how many manatees we have right now. Pre-COVID, we used to fly about once a year when we had a big cold front come through, and it would concentrate all the manatees into one area, and so we could fly and count. JU was one of 17 agencies across the state that flew at the same time, and in doing so, we could get an count, and we watched the count increase until a couple of years ago. In post-COVID, COVID we had to stop doing it, but then since then we haven't really had that big cold front come through that concentrates them. And you have to sort of see it coming a few days ahead so that you can organize it to get everybody to fly within a 2 or 3 day period. And what you have then is simply an indication of how, that's the minimum number of manatees you know exist. You don't know how many you didn't see. So they're there. So next slide. So my take-home lesson is, as Pogo said in the first Earth Day, I've seen the problem and he is us. I've seen the enemy and he is us. What we still need to do is take care of our own mess. The more you can watch how much water you use, how much electricity you use, how much trash you use, how much plastic you use. I can do a whole talk on plastic, that's a whole new issue. But if you watch what you're doing and take care of your own mess, you can make a difference. You may think, oh, what I do as an individual doesn't make a difference, but it does. And collectively, we can make a difference. And so when I start looking at where we are, next slide, I've watched a lot of changes over the years. And we continue to watch changes over the next slide. And I'm actually very optimistic. We are getting more data than we've ever gotten. In fact, it's become a problem because we have these massive data sets. One of the things that's made, because we have all these handheld meters, we get lots and lots of data that analyze things. And I used to do some lake studies in which we were happy we got quarterly reports. Well, now we can do this almost hourly, if not minute by minute, and we can track what happens, and we realize how much variation there is in these things. But I do think that we've got a very, very bright future. I've watched technology emerge with things like artificial intelligence. I personally am not afraid of artificial intelligence. I think it's something we're going to embrace. Students are already doing it. And I think it's something we're going to see a great benefit from in the future. And so I'm very optimistic. I think it's very bright. And so I might have fun and enjoy the ride. So, comments, Dex? No, I think there was one more. Okay. So. Do you want to do questions or not? Or do questions, or you can talk to me afterwards at the coffee? How do you want to do it? You got to conclude in 2 minutes, so you got to. Thank you all very much.